Hi, I'm Kathleen Sabo of New Mexico Ethics Watch, and this is Ethics Now, conversations about ethics in everyday life. Our guests today are Adrianne Turner. She's the General Counsel of the Law Offices of the Public Defender. Kim Chavez Cook, she's the Appellate Defender, again for the Law Offices of the Public Defender. And Lalita Moskowitz, ACLU of New Mexico Staff Attorney and Equal Justice Works Fellow. Thanks you all for joining me today. We appreciate it. And this is the first time we've had multiple guests on a podcast. So you all are seasoned Zoomers and video conferencers. So we'll take it as it goes here. So the first thing we usually do on our podcast is sort of get a baseline for our listeners about what we all might mean by being ethical, or what is ethical. And since there are three of you, I'll go ahead and just throw out some of the general things that I've heard from other guests. And then you'll have an opportunity to tell me, I disagree with that, here's something else I would add. So they're pretty general. But when people talk about ethical, they talk about honesty, they talk about integrity, they talk about how there's always some concern for others, someone outside of yourself. How is what I'm going to do or what someone else is going to do going to impact not just me, but for others, whether they're my colleagues, the people in my community. And those are sort of the general things I'm hearing. Would anyone like to either disagree with any of that or add something to that you think is particular to our issue today or not?
I was thinking about that as well. I'll jump in and say, I think that of the examples you've provided, the concern for others in the community is certainly sort of the foundational ethical issue that I think we have been focused on in the work that we're doing on prisons and jails in particular. And I think another aspect that I would throw into the mix is accountability and transparency. But as far as, concern for others, I think for me, and it's sort of been a guiding principle of my career path, and I think probably true for the other guests as well, is that concern as it relates specifically to sort of marginalized or disenfranchised communities who don't otherwise have a voice or struggle to have a voice. And so that's sort of where this all began, I think.
Absolutely. I would agree with Kim and just add that in terms of what we're here to talk about today in jails and prisons, those ethical questions that we ask and decisions that we make about who we lock up and why we would lock somebody up in prison, and then what we owe folks that are incarcerated. So those are the sort of real heavy questions that I'm glad we're here to talk about.
Yeah. And Lalita, anything you want to add? You don't have to, but you're welcome to.
I was just thinking too, what Kim said about sort of folks who don't necessarily have a voice or whose voice doesn't get heard. I think about the way that I use my privilege of being able to go to law school, to have a law degree, how I use that sort of those tools that I've been privileged to get, and what that sort of responsibility that places on me as well.
Well, thanks to all of you for adding to the thoughts that have been coming our way on what it is to be ethical or act ethically. So again, for the listener, we're talking today about whether it's ethical to keep people in prisons and jails during the pandemic, and what the actions are that are being taken on people who are marginalized, their behalf. And so we talked a little bit about what it means to be ethical. Let's talk now about something that some people might not even realize, and that's the difference between jails and prisons, because we're going to have some separate situations here. And I know, Kim, you said you'd like to just address that quickly, please.
Sure. So I think as it relates to the ethical questions we're looking at, the primary difference, I think, is that jails are going to have a large population of people who are not yet convicted of anything. they stand accused only. And so they have a constitutional presumption of innocence. And so that's a huge factor in the distinctions. There are also people serving sentences in jails, but for the most part, those sentences are for misdemeanor or otherwise minor offenses for which they only got a year or less. Under New Mexico law, that's kind of where we draw that line. And then in the prisons, we're looking at people who are serving a sentence of a year or more, which typically means the felony conviction. There can be misdemeanors involved as well. Multiple misdemeanors can add up to that, but for the most part, that's like sort of the primary distinction. And you're serving an actual sentence in prison. You've been convicted of something is the main distinction.
Okay, so are prisons run by the state and jails run by counties? Is that also something as well? Are there different authorities?
Thank you. That's also a critical distinction for our discussion, because then it's who's responsible for them becomes different as well. So the county jails are run by individual counties, and then the state prison system is run by the state, although we do also have a couple of prisons that, although ultimately operated by the state, are on a daily basis run by private entities. And so that's also can be a factor. All
right, well, since we see a distinction, let's go ahead and talk about them separately. So let's talk about prisons first, because all three of you have been involved in, boy, really current activity. Some people might be aware that the Supreme Court weighed in on prison issues just last week. Who wants to take the lead here and talk about what's been going on in the prisons, activities by you all, why it's of import? Who wants to jump in first?
Sure. Yeah.
Oh, Lalita, go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, I can talk about prisons. We, I think you asked, first, like, sort of what's been going on, and the thing that we're sort of really concerned about right now, of course, is COVID-19 in the prisons, and what that looks like, and the reason it's such an important area to focus on, besides just the fact that that's another sort of area of our community that we need to be thinking about, is because prisons are these closed environments where people in really close quarters and don't have the option to socially distance, we're in communal spaces, in eating and sleeping and all of those things. And so it was immediately a concern for us, and given how this virus spreads. And so we've seen across the country that concern is really warranted. We've seen outbreaks in prisons be really deadly, and the virus spreads very quickly in those environments. And so, we've been pushing for measures to protect folks behind the walls, but also we know that unless the population is reduced in a way that people can implement those kind of guidelines, social distancing that the CDC has recommended, that's really the only way to keep people safe. And so that's why, we've been advocating for release.
Well, so one of the things we do when we post the program description is we list a whole bunch of resources for people, or we attach them. And one of the things we'll be attaching is a petition to our Supreme Court. So tell me a little bit about that. When did that happen? What did you argue? And what happened? What happened as a result of that petition? Who wants to jump in there?
Sure, I'm happy to. So we filed the petition April 14th, if I recall correctly. And then the court had under the procedure that we used, which is called an extraordinary writ, is what we were seeking. It's a procedure to sort of go straight to the Supreme Court with an issue of substantial public importance, and that we filed as an emergency writ petition based on the sort of time-sensitive need to address the pandemic-related concerns. We were raising we were asking the court to help get a population reduction in the prison system, to, like Lalita said, to make it possible for inmates to socially distance. That was sort of the crux of it. The legal basis that we asserted that gave the court the ability to do that was that otherwise there was to not take that kind of remedial action would be and the legal jargon for it is deliberate indifference to a risk of substantial harm, which is an Eighth Amendment claim under the federal Constitution. There's a state constitutional equivalent as well. And that that although there were some measures being done in prison to limit some of the risk, that because they did not account for asymptomatic carriers primarily and did not really allow for social distancing within housing areas, that it was insufficient to address the risk of the virus spreading. So that's sort of like the crux of the petition. And then the court ordered responses from the parties we had identified as the respondents to the petition, which was the Department of Corrections and the governor primarily. And then also as parties of interest, the Attorney General's Office and DA's Association, because they have interests in sentences being fulfilled. And then there was oral argument held on last Monday, a week ago today. And then the court deliberated after argument and announced its decision, which it found we had not established factually that there was deliberate indifference, that particular prong of the test. So they denied our relief. And then to complete the thought, the very next day, what we saw was that the governor's office announced a plan for widespread testing, which was one of the major things that we were urging them to do. So, our hope is that just by raising the issue in the court and publicly, that we were able to put some pressure on to get the testing implemented. But of course, there's still work to be done.
Well, and that's one of the things I want our listeners to know, that even though the Supreme Court ruled a certain way, denying the petition, there was still an impact, and a substantial impact for prisoners. And I read all the briefs and responses, and I saw y'all had a long list of things you wanted to have happen in the prisons. How many other things do you think are possible in your list of requests in your petition that might happen? What are you hearing? What are you hoping? The testing is, some people might say testing is not important, but I think most people think it is, and we'll just stop there with that and saying that. So that's a great achievement. What else do you think might come of your petition?
Well, I would hope that just more public awareness of the kind of risks that people are facing when they're in custody, and even greater implementation of some of the policies that they have started in terms of masks and allowing social distancing, and that's increased availability of soap, things like that. I hope that the focus switches to those kinds of measures inside, as well, instead of, I should say, some of the measures that they've really relied on in terms of isolation and locking down these facilities, so that the people who can't leave, they don't have access to other people. They don't have access to resources, to the kinds of education programming and visitation that they are, that they normally would have, and that really support their ability to forget what I wanted to say there. Sorry. to come out with, to be able to reintegrate into society, and all of those different functions have really been cut back. And so hopefully, I think one of the things we all want to see is a switch from that sort of lockdown mechanism to more availability, just like we do on the outside.
Well, let's talk about some basics just for a minute. How many people do we have in prisons here in New Mexico?
The approximate number is about 6,500.
6,500, and it has in prisons themselves. Okay, and has that number decreased recently? Or, I know there was sort of a promise that people would be released. I saw something in the news that said maybe 10 people had been released in response to an order for early release. Is that accurate?
I think
it's a little more than that now.
Yeah. No more than now? Okay.
But not by much.
Exactly. It's still very low. I'm not sure of the current number. I don't know if any of the other guests know the current number. The last number I heard was 33 people released.
Okay.
And what we don't know is how many more people have entered the system during the time that those, 30 something people have been released. So we don't really know whether the population has been reduced ultimately. And I wanted to just add to your question about what we hope might happen. I think it's important for folks to know that just because the Supreme Court didn't order the governor and corrections department to release folks, it doesn't mean they don't still have the power to do that and to make that decision. And perhaps as the results of the testing come in, we're certainly hoping that will still happen, that folks will still be released.
Well, and one of the arguments made by the opposition was that this is a violation of the separation of powers to ask the courts to weigh in on this. So hopefully the executive will say, we are the ones who can handle this and we can take care of it. Let's do the right thing. I mean, that's what we can hope for. Let's go back to the prisons just for a second, because myself, I'm not in this realm a lot, not, thinking about it, talking about it. I don't know that I've ever been in a prison. So maybe some people aren't even aware of the conditions. I mean, we're talking about people who are living on top of one another a lot of times, aren't we? And we're talking about people who have to buy soap. Is that an accurate depiction?
Yeah, I want to let Lalita take the bulk of this, but I want to just really quickly, I want to inject to make sure that it sort of is in the background, that it depends from facility to facility, and what they categorize, they classify inmates based on their security risk levels. And so there's going to be some living condition differences based on that. And they've also, under the current COVID plan that they have described in their pleadings, they are isolating entirely people who are in what they call the long-term care unit. So people who are in sort of medical crisis already for whatever reason are being fully isolated from everybody else. So with those two sort of caveats, I'll let Lalita sort of describe more broadly what it's like in the prisons.
Yeah, thanks for that, Kim. Yeah, exactly. It does depend by facility, but in many facilities, folks are living in sort of dorm-like situations, either bunks or they've got beds that are, really close together, head to head, in larger pods. Normally, folks go to dining halls, in big groups, and that was one of the things we were worried about, particularly in light of COVID-19. Normally, yes, people have to buy soap or other hygiene supplies at commissary. And one of course, is a really concerning normally because people aren't making, prison jobs pay 30 cents to maybe $1 an hour, and then you're having to sort of buy necessities. These are some of the things that are always true. And just, communal living space, communal bathrooms, areas in the pods where people are touching all the same surfaces and in all the same areas. And you just don't have, in a prison, you don't have control over where you go, who you talk to, when you eat, when you get your medication. I mean, every part of your life is controlled by the facility, which is why it's such an ethical obligation for the state and for the prisons to take care of people in those environments. And this is something the Supreme Court has recognized too, in looking at the 8th Amendment and saying, when you take over control of somebody's life so entirely in this way, you then have an obligation to make sure that they are getting the basic needs, including healthcare, including safety, and things like that. Because I think for many of us, it's probably really hard to imagine what it's like to have your entire life really completely controlled and to not be able to make some basic decisions, like who you come in contact with, and those kind of things. Yeah.
There are going to be people who would say it's not ethical to let out people who are going to be a danger to the community, who are going to be, repeat the same things they've done. So who are the people who you all think ought to be let out? I mean, I think that's an important question.
It is. I think that was the cornerstone of the ethical dilemma that our case presented, and that we grappled with going into it when we were designing what remedy we were seeking. And what proved very difficult for the court to grapple with as well, and during oral argument, it was clear that there was a lot of tension there, and understandably. If I can take a first stab at this, I would say, that some of the guiding principles that I was thinking of are, what you learn in first-year law school, criminal law, the philosophical sort of societal justifications of punishing people under a criminal law system, which are retribution, rehabilitation, deterrence, and incapacitation. And so offsetting those interests that society has in locking people up, we were trying to identify for what particular people are those interests offset by the public health concerns associated with a potential outbreak in the prison, which, and if we haven't said it yet, is not just about the inmates themselves, it's about the entire surrounding community, because the staff go into the prison and go home every day. And so it's not just about the inmates, it's also about the staff and the people who they make contact with when they're not at work. And then it's also about the burden that might place on the local, largely rural medical system. If they have an outbreak in the prison and they have to transport a bunch of prisoners to a hospital for care, what does that do to the whole community? So I want to make sure that's part of the math as well. And so the groups that we identified in our request to be the targets for release, essentially, were people for whom that retribution, deterrence, incapacitation interest was reduced. So they were people who were nonviolent offenders, people who were near to their release date anyway, and so are going to be re-entering society in the coming months anyway. People who were serving a sentence for a technical parole violation or technical probation violation, which means the only thing they actually really did now to be incarcerated was not criminal in and of itself. They are serving their underlying criminal sentence, but the thing that got them there was a violation of a condition, like they drank alcohol when they weren't supposed to, or something like that. So I think that's how we tussled with that ethical question. And then there's also the ethical question of is it actually safer for those people, or better for those people to be outside rather than inside, if they don't have a place to live, if they don't have access to medical care except for what the prison provides. And so we had to address that in our remedy request as well, and make sure that those sorts of needs would also be met on the outside, because a lot of the people in prison suffered from poverty before they were incarcerated. So do they have resources on the outside was part of the question.
Well, and just to break in for a second, because one of the things you forwarded to me, Kim, it was suggestions or guidelines or a path forward put out by the Drug Policy Alliance about how to release people, about what to look for. Do they have resources they have available or not? And we'll include that in our resources as well, because I think that opened my eyes to all the things that need to be considered when people are actually leaving prison. So thank you for that and forwarding it. Who else wants to weigh in at this point? Adrianne?
I didn't hear a question. I'm sorry, you broke up a little bit, so I didn't know if there was an exact question on the table.
Well, let me move to this one then. If whatever Kim said you want to add on to, our Attorney General Hector Baldera said we also should be consulting victims and their families about whether people ought to be released. Is that an ethical consideration, or is there something that is above that at this point? What do y'all think about that?
Well, I certainly think it is part of the ethical equation and that balancing that we recognized, and we certainly, we put into our proposed remedy to make sure that was complied with. Their statutory requirements around notifying some victims of release. And so we wanted to make sure that was, of course, going to be followed through with. So I think it absolutely is.
And I would just add to that, this is a complex issue for a number of reasons. And also I think it's important to remember and sort of recognize that this is an extraordinary moment. This pandemic presents really unusual circumstances. And so all of these things are conversations that sort of exist in normal life. And then there's also this context that is so different. And when we're talking about putting people's lives at very real risk, some of these things look a little bit different. But I also wanted to just add that, victims aren't a monolith, and many people who have been victims of a crime believe that we should be reforming our criminal justice system in general, and that we should be relying on incarceration less in general. And so those, even that kind of issue isn't so black and white in terms of like what people who have been victim of a crime might want in general and in terms of incarceration, but also I think in this moment. And so to just sort of represent that as well.
So important, Lalita. Thank you for bringing that up. I think that's such a good point. And I also just wanted to add, not so much specifically about victims, but the broader picture of what we were asking for in terms of structure for our remedy, and the special master program that we had envisioned, because I think that's really a part of sort of how we envisioned all of these different ethical issues being balanced, really, and a recognition that that there were a lot of factors, and so the categories that Kim talked about of people that we thought were the best candidates for this release program were not, even under our recommendations, were not going to be released wholesale, just one day, everybody released. That was not even what we were asking for. We were asking to take a look at these different categories and to set up a system where if there was a concern where perhaps the district attorney or the attorney general thought that an individual did pose such a great public safety risk that they would not be, that they should be kept in prison and they weren't a good candidate, they could make that kind of objection, and that the public defender department could respond, and there could be this sort of expedited back and forth about making sure that we were making the best choices we could about release, and then ultimately having a special master make any decisions where we couldn't come to a decision or an agreement.
Yeah, and that sort of gives me a thought that I wanted to add as well, which is the fact that, this all comes to pass, and this before the pandemic even occurred. The context that it all is happening in is the fact that, statistically speaking, the United States incarcerates more people than any other country of an economic, equivalent to ours. And so there is also an underlying ethical question about who we should be incarcerating in the first place. And I think Adrianne touched on that at the very beginning, but I don't want to lose sight of it, even though that wasn't the point of our litigation, because our litigation is very much responsive to the pandemic. It's certainly a reality that it all is happening within. And because of that, and because we have so many people incarcerated, if we aren't reducing the population in the prisons, the only other way to quote unquote protect the inmates and the staff during this pandemic is that sort of lockdown. And there are very well-studied medical concerns about that level of isolation. The legislature passed the Solitary Confinement Act a couple of years ago to limit the use of solitary confinement because we know the psychological trauma associated with it can have lifelong impacts. And that's sort of the only other go-to alternative right now for keeping people isolated to protect them from COVID is to put them in solitary confinement. And that's what is happening right now for a lot of inmates. If they have a cell and they're not living in those dormitory style housing units, they're in lockdown. They're in solitary right now. And that's a concern as well. So
right, both for physical and mental health. which, we've talked a lot about physical health here, but the mental health aspect, I mean, I can't even imagine in general the mental health aspect of prison, but in these circumstances where no visitors are allowed and there's very little contact, I mean, I'm getting a chill. It just must be horrific for people. Here's a bad news, good news sort of thing. So the bad news is that a lot of people think we're going to be in this situation for quite some time until we get a vaccine. So the good news, and maybe this is just my optimistic framing, but the good news is we have time to get this right. We can keep looking at this again. If you didn't get a special master, it could be a month down the road, 2 months down the road, when someone says, you know what, that's a good idea. We need that. So, again, sort of looking on the small bright side, but we are going to have a chance to keep revisiting things and keep getting it right. And that'll be my hope. So we're going to just move to jails now. And then we can always circle back, or we can always, talk about things that are common to both, but let's talk about jails. I know there are going to be a lot of the same concerns, but what has happened with jails? I mean, we haven't had a petition to the Supreme Court, I don't think. So who wants to jump in and tell us what's going on with jails around the state?
I'll start and just say that in some ways the jails are really some of the bright spots that I think that we have, and that in New Mexico we have followed a real national trend of releasing and really reducing our jail populations in a way that we haven't seen in prisons. And so we have across the state, the last numbers, at least that I'm aware of, our jail populations specifically across the board are down about 35%. And that really varies facility by facility. And so there are some with much higher reductions, 50, 60% less people than they had, just a few months ago. And that is a real bright spot to me, that not just that there are less people in custody, but that to get there, I think it means that we have taken a much better look at who we are putting in jail and why we would arrest somebody. And so I will start with that. But of course, there's much more to talk about jails in terms of just how they look. They're very tend to be more of the dormitory style. And so there's a lot of physical differences. And I know that Lalita has worked on some individual jail inmate cases, and she might want to talk about those. Go ahead.
Yeah, jump in, Lalita, please.
Yeah, and I actually would just add another component that makes the risk, potentially higher in jails, is that people often are, we talked about people who are in jail before they're convicted and who are pretrial and who may have just been booked for a day or two after being arrested and then will be released. And so you have more people cycling through that environment, which increases the risk that the virus will come into that environment as well.
Absolutely.
And so that's, that's a crucial component.
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt.
So what's the alternative though to somebody getting arrested and being in jail for a day or two? What is there a good alternative that would keep people from entering and leaving that population? Do we have?
Well, for a lot of folks, the alternative is to not prosecute them at all. I think in some of the really lower level offenses that we're seeing, and that is one of the reasons that jail populations are down, is that prosecutors are electing to arrest and prosecute fewer people on the lower level side of things. But there's also one does not need to be arrested to be prosecuted and charged with a crime, and so they can be issued a citation and a summons to appear in court without ever having to be arrested and put into jail, because most of those folks will be let out, and which is what Lalita was talking about, right? Like you will, if you are released on your own recognizances, you might be in the jail for a day or two, and that kind of churn of people turning over inside in those close dormitory facilities, as Lalita is saying, was just such a risk, such a health risk.
Yeah, and I want to jump in there just to provide a couple examples of the kinds of things when you say they shouldn't be prosecuted at all or they shouldn't be arrested at all, and say that some of the low-hanging fruit that we targeted very early on, and it feels like a million years ago now, but I'm talking about in March, basically, where we started with those conversations with jail administrators and local county prosecutors and things like that, were, okay, who right now is just being held on a failure to pay a fine? Didn't commit a crime, didn't pay a fine, and now they're in jail waiting for however long, you know. So that's the kind of people that we're talking about to some extent. And then also just like low-level misdemeanor offenses, public intoxication kind of stuff. Like, let's not incarcerate that. And so that was a starting place. And then in addition to the categories Adrianne identified in terms of people who shouldn't come into the jail in the first place, the other place we targeted was people who were being charged with something and were being held pre-trial, but where there really wasn't a need to hold them pre-trial. Like they have this prosecution pending, they know that, send them home and let them wait for their trial there. And that was another big area where we tried to target those efforts for county jails.
So since we don't have like an overarching authority like the Department of Corrections for county jails, how are you all approaching the jails? Do you have to do them one at a time? Like, you have to call up the Bernalillo County Detention Center, and then you have to call up someone in Farmington or some. Wow, that's
absolutely,
that's intensive.
That's exactly what we have had to do. And because the Public Defender Department is a statewide agency, although we don't have offices in every county, but we're a statewide agency, we have folks that work in a lot of these counties. And that's exactly what the leaders of our offices have done, is get in contact with the county sheriffs, with the jail administrators, with the district attorneys, with all of the parties that are involved. And we really saw a lot of success with that in reducing these populations, of doing things much like what we recommended and asked for in our petition at the statewide level, and exchanging lists of inmates who were at the highest risk, or inmates who were just there pre-trial waiting their trial and could be released, and going and engaging in that back and forth process. And that's what our local office leaders were able to do in a lot of areas to bring the populations down. But it is very time intensive, but there is not one overarching person to go to.
What can this? Yeah, go ahead, Lalita.
I was just going to add, sort of to summarize some of what is being said too, that there's really a role for all areas of the criminal legal system here. Local police can issue citations instead of arrests. Jails, can make decisions. Judges can make decisions about who they decide to hold. Probation offices, parole can sort of expedite things. There's really a role for everybody in the criminal legal system to be able to be helping out in this environment. And so one of the early things that we and other attorneys did was write letters to various folks like that and sort of say, here's the things that you could be doing, because it's a coordinated effort in a lot of ways to try to keep people safe.
What people who are listening, citizens or even prisoners themselves, what can people be doing if they think that this is a situation still in need of more remedy? What can people do? You have any suggestions?
Well, I think for inmates and their families, we've certainly been trying to make available pro se motions that they can file to get just a single individual out. That doesn't necessarily address the population control angle, but it can provide individual safety for people, especially those who have a medical precondition that places them at higher risk from COVID-19. And so that's certainly something for that population, the people who have actual loved ones incarcerated. I think other people who are concerned, I think there's, like Lalita said a little while ago, although the court didn't order the executive to take these particular release actions, as we pointed out to the executive back in March, the governor has, and the corrections department have statutory authority to early release people when they need to address population concerns or address a pandemic like we're having. And so, but that's all up to them. It's in their discretion. And so there's political fear there, very understandably, because of all of the ethical issues we've been talking about. It's hard to pull the trigger on something like that. I don't know, maybe phone calls to the governor, letting them know that voters want that, would help. I don't know if it would have an instant effect, but that's certainly a way to get involved. And, you know, beyond that, I'm not sure if anybody else has particular suggestions. I think making it known that the public supports that kind of solution is probably the most critical.
Yeah, and I believe this sort of action item on our website is still live, where we were asking folks to contact the governor. And Kathleen, I can send you that link if you want to include it here. That's an action item people can take. The other thing is my colleague Barron was collecting pictures with folks. So the governor a while back held up a picture of her mom and said, you know, this is who we're social distancing for. This is who we're trying to protect. And so he started collecting pictures from folks with pictures of their own loved ones who incarcerated, to remind people that, you know, people behind bars are somebody's loved one, and they also want to be kept safe. And so if there are folks listening who have somebody behind bars and who want to sort of speak out about what that means to them, they can certainly contact the ACLU about that as well.
Well, and yes, go ahead, Adrianne. You want to add something?
I was going to add that longer term and bigger picture, I think what I would like to see people do is really advocate for reinvesting in our communities, in alternatives to incarceration, so that we are not faced with the kind of where, you know, when somebody, I think Kim mentioned some of the lower level crimes, and a lot of them are driven by homelessness, and they're driven by mental illness, and they are driven by addiction issues, and we don't want to see those people, we don't want to see incarceration as the answer to those problems. And so that bigger picture, I am glad that we are shining that light right now on some of the different ways that we can respond to our societal problems.
Well, it sounds like in addition to some of the specific ethical things, that's sort of the bottom line for you there. The most ethical thing is let's take care of each other. Kim, you wanted to add something?
I did, thank you. I wanted to just dovetail off of that to say one sort of related thing, which is how odd it is that we find ourselves, I mean, some of the questions that were being asked when we filed our petition, how odd I find it when the question can even be asked, would this person be safer in prison or outside of prison? And I just, as a society, what does that say that we would ever even question that? Like, out of prison is going to be better. Obviously, like, the pandemic presents part of that, but I think what the crux of that question was that were being raised by a lot of folks was that, but if you release them, they won't have anywhere to live, they won't have any way to eat, they won't have medical care. What does that say? We should always, you should always have those things. And so that's, I think, another part of just one of the sort of larger ethical questions that gets raised by the work that we're doing right now. You know, there should always be a place for someone to go home to. We need to make sure that we're providing that for our community members. So yes, thank you for letting me add that.
Yeah, no, light being shown on some stark realities and inequities. So lastly, is there anything that we haven't talked about that y'all would feel remiss, each of you, if we don't mention here today on this podcast? You put your thinking cap on, your finger to your forehead. What else do you want to say, that this is a chance to say it when we're talking about this issue? Anything, or have we done well? Have we covered most of it?
Something I would just add, sort of as a almost, sort of overarching issue, is that people, we need transparency and accountability within our carceral facilities and within our prisons. And one of the challenges to the work ongoing is that people don't have a good understanding of what goes on in prisons. we don't shine a light on what it really means to be in prison, or what that looks like, or what the environment is. And so that's sort of an ongoing concern, and it's I think important to sort of the advocacy work, and to sort of just the ethics of incarceration as well, is to be able to be transparent and clear about what it is as a society that we're imposing on people.
Yeah, that's where I was headed as well, as sort of a concluding thought. And I think in the context of the pandemic, what that means to me is, you know, it's great. I'm really glad that the governor and the corrections department have decided to do the widespread testing they're doing. I hope that they follow through and test all inmates. They've only so far committed to testing 25%. I hope that they test everyone. And I hope that there's transparency on those results. And then once we have them, I hope that there's transparency on what they do with those results. Now that they have that information, what decision-making is being made as a result. That's, I think, would be very helpful to not only assuring the public that things are being done in a reasonable way, but especially for the inmates themselves, the staff themselves, and the loved ones of all of those directly affected populations.
Well, yes, Adrianne, last thoughts.
I really agree with both of those concluding thoughts. That transparency issue in all of these different ways, right? The transparency of what they're doing inside prisons to handle this outbreak, the transparency of who our leaders have decided, who our government has decided should be put in jails or in prisons, and that we're making really informed and thoughtful decisions about that. And that that these conversations going forward, I hope they continue. I really appreciate you asking these really in-depth questions at these of these things, and that we need to always be including the affected people. Although Kim and Lalita and I have collectively worked in this field for a long time, I know I've never been incarcerated. I've never, and I don't experience it the same way that people who have been in prison or whose family members are in prison right now do, and that we have to make sure we're including them in the conversations about how we move forward.
Point taken. Well, I really appreciate y'all being here, and hope that as circumstances merit, if we have new developments, that we might get to talk with you again down the road, even months from now. So thank you. So I want to say thank you to our guests for being with us today, Adrianne Turner and Kim Chavez Cook from the Law Offices of the Public Defender, and Lalita Moskowitz with the ACLU. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for joining us. You can connect to every Ethics Now episode on www.ethicsnow.org or on all major podcast platforms. Visit our Ethics Watch Facebook page to suggest topics or guests, or email us at ethicsnowshow@gmail.com. Thanks for listening, and see you next time on Ethics Now. Be well, stay safe.